over the last 18 years, Doctor of Human Sexuality, Emily Morse, has been a best-selling author, a pioneering MasterClass Instructor, a live SiriusXM radio host and executive producer, and the host of the #1 sexuality podcast on iTunes, Sex with Emily. Emily has helped millions of people around the world navigate their sex lives. Her candid conversations challenge cultural taboos, misinformation, and awkward sex talks to create a future where people can deeply connect and embrace pleasure-filled lives. But long before Emily was making it, she was faking it. And I'm talking about orgasms. Here to share her path to authentic orgasmic pleasure, please welcome Emily Morse.
Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the having me join you in the Authentic Rebel series. This has been so wonderful hearing everyone's stories. So for 20 years, it's been almost 20 years now, I've been on a mission to liberate the conversation around sex and pleasure. And so people often wonder, like, how does that happen? How do you get started on this? And so first, I guess I could ask everyone here, anyone have a great sex education? Anyone like they had all the information, your parents told you everything, you had great classes in schools? Because I didn't. So I grew up where I had like one day of sex education in school, and, it was all about anatomy, and it was mostly like fear-based. Don't get pregnant, don't get an STI, right? That was about it. We didn't learn anything about anatomy, and we certainly didn't talk about pleasure. And side note, a lot hasn't changed today. For me, that was, 30 plus years ago. I was in high school and I talk to a lot of young people now, and it hasn't really changed that much, meaning we don't enter pleasure into the conversation around sex. But that's how I started. I did a lot of sex education, and it's almost like, think of it this way. It's like giving your kids the keys to a car to go drive, but they never took, driver's training. They don't have a license. And so I very much felt that way. I started, having sex, being sexually active in my teens and 20s. But I started feeling like something was wrong with me, because I certainly wasn't having as much pleasure as my partners. They were always having a good time. I can tell you that. And I thought, am I broken? Is something wrong with me? Why does it always feel good to them? How come sometimes I don't want sex as much? How come in long-term relationships that I was in, after a while, it just wasn't so exciting anymore? And when I went looking for answers, I really couldn't find anything at all. And nowadays, a lot of kids are like, well, there's porn. And they think, well, that must be how you have sex. But back then, there wasn't even porn to mess me up. It was more like I would talk to my friends and they would say, oh, yeah, whenever someone said to me, last night, I had the most amazing sex in my life, I would always stop them and be like, wait, what do you mean? Like, was his penis double jointed? Did you have 26 orgasms? Like, what does great sex mean? And I felt very, very lost in this. I didn't have there wasn't a lot of places to go for this information. And so, to be honest, what happened was I was really performative. I've come to find the name for the kind of sex where you're just doing what your partner wants and what I thought my partner wanted, making the noises, doing all the arching in the back of my back and contorting myself into positions and basically faking orgasms. And I will admit it here. I had to admit that was one of my big first steps, really realizing that I don't want to be this I don't want to fake orgasms. I want to have sex that is more realistic and enjoyable. And so this went on for a while. So I first realized in my 20s that I wasn't having great sex. Then I realized more about my body, but it wasn't until my 30s that I thought, this is it. I'm not going to continue on this path. It just seems really, really unfair. So that's when it led to starting this podcast 20 years ago. So what happened was I started to invite a bunch of friends over to my house, to my living room in San Francisco, and I started interviewing them about their sex lives and their relationships. And it turned out that first, I wasn't really alone. A lot of people didn't have this information about sex. A lot of people had a lot of the same questions about it. So I figured first off that this was my path. And I realized that was my first thing, that when I step into who I am, sharing my authentic story, that first, I wasn't alone. A lot of people I realized needed this information as well. And I did everything I could to learn about sex at that time. Now, I was still doing the podcast, but I was in no way the expert. I read every book on sex that I could find. And I went back to grad school and I got my doctorate in human sexuality. And for the next, I'd say, 10 years, I really did start helping people with all the questions about sex that they had. They wanted to know the right positions, the sex toys, the things to say, how to talk dirty. And I could do that. Like if anyone had questions right now, I could pretty much answer any single sex question that you have. And so if that's really great and that's really inspiring, like it's so great to know how to maybe give myself pleasure and how to masturbate, how to feel good, and how to share that with other people. But then I realized after all this time that really people want a quick fix for sex. They're like, what is the next thing that I can do? Because sex is still shrouded in mystery. Even today, there's so much still fear around it. There's so much shame around it. There's so much trauma. But I thought that there was another layer here to go a little bit deeper. And so what I realized is that before I could do any of this stuff, and after talking to, millions of people, that what's really holding us back is it's not even about sex. If you think about it, a lot of it is about pleasure. A lot of us think that not only don't we deserve to have great sex, there's these underlying beliefs that we don't deserve pleasure, we don't deserve to feel good. And I call these the pleasure thieves. These are the things that are keeping us from having pleasure. Okay. And they show up in every area of our life. And that's stress, trauma, and shame. Okay. So it's kind of a heady stew. But it's true that if we have any of these, which raise your hand, I'd be really surprised if people don't experience any of that. But stress, trauma, and shame are the things that we have to unpack first before we can even get into pleasure. And so the first one, stressed. I realized that personally, even though I knew all the things to do, that if I had a really stressful day or I had anxiety and I had these spikes in cortisol and I was running around worried, that there was no way that I was going to be able to show up in the bedroom and be ready to go. And in fact, I felt like in some ways I was still performing because I'd be working all day and then I'd go see my partner and be like, I got to go. I thought, well, no, that's really not going to work until I'm really able to sort of get into my own, stress and find ways to release my stress and to be more present. The second thing that comes up is trauma. So all of us have trauma in our life, whether it's a big T trauma or a little T trauma. And I realized that in a lot of ways that trauma shows up is if we've had, a lot of people had sexual assault or trauma, and that's definitely going to live in our nervous system. And for me, I just had a lot growing up that, just trauma, like in my childhood, that was still preventing me from really allowing myself to let go and experience pleasure. And so I went back to therapy after some time. I was always in talk therapy, but what I realized is we really have to start to release there's so much that's, still in our bodies and things that were going on. And I did some EMDR therapy and I did some somatic experiencing. And then the third one is shame. Now, shame is so heady. In fact, I think that shame is probably the most pervasive of all the pleasure thieves. I mean, maybe we grew up in an environment where, we were told that it wasn't okay to be sexual, that it wasn't okay to have sex before marriage. It wasn't okay to, ask for what we want. And as a woman, I know that there was a lot of shaming around that too, that there was shame around just being sexually expressive. It's like, we can't win. Either we ask for what we want and we're labeled something, or we just kind of sit back and let things happen to us and we don't have any pleasure. And I had shame that came up too. I remember when I started therapy years ago, everyone said that it's like the peeling back the layers of the onion and you're never really done. And the truth is, with everything, you are with any kind of therapy or self-work or journey that we're on, we're never really done. And shame is one of those words that we've always heard, but when it comes to pleasure, it's helpful to know what we're talking about here. And a lot of people use the words shame and guilt interchangeably. But in truth, they are attached different stated beliefs. And I love the quote by Brene Brown that says, guilt is a feeling that I did something bad. While shame goes deeper. It's I am bad. So I realized that I still was carrying that. And a lot of my listeners were too, that until I could give them any advice, they had to clear out the things that were blocking them from having pleasure. And I had to do it myself at every layer. I had to realize that there was still shame in my experience level. Why wasn't I turned on? And in many earlier days, it was why couldn't I have orgasms? And so, if we're struggling in these areas, it's like, and we want to be the best we could be. We want to show up. It's not until we can really like clear some things that are holding us back. And so I always say, and I just wrote a book about this called Smart Sex, How to Boost Your Sex IQ and Own Your Pleasure. When I was writing the book, I thought everyone's coming to me for tips. They're going to want the anal tips and the blowjob tips and oral sex, because those are the things that people want. But I started it out with the pleasure thieves, because I thought there is no way that we're all going to have a life of pleasure and connection. And let me just say this. When I'm talking about pleasure, I realize it's not even just about sex. It's about allowing ourselves and knowing that we deserve it. I thought I got to start with the pleasure thieves before we can get into everything else. So maybe you want to reflect on too, like, are there things in your life that might be keeping you from realizing that you are deserving of pleasure? Because pleasure is our birthright. We are all deserving of pleasure. And when I say that, it's not just sex, it's pleasurable things in our life. It's hanging out with friends. Maybe it's gardening, going for a walk. How much time do we actually spend allowing ourselves to do these things? And in fact, I was out this retreat a few years ago, or maybe it was like over 10 years ago, when I first started on this second layer of my journey. And you had to write down all the things we did in our lives that gave us pleasure, right? And then there was like a math equation, and you had to go through it. It's actually in my book. And it was like, what are all the things you do that give you? And I realized that I did all the math and I wrote everything out, and it came out, and you do an equation. What percentage of your life is pleasurable, is for you, is things that make you feel good, not because you have to check something off the list. Because we also put conditions on pleasure. I don't deserve to fill in the blank until I cross everything off my list, until I make a certain amount of money, until I have the relationship. There's all these conditions. But pleasure is actually productive. The more that we actually have to say, I'm going to have more pleasure in my life, I'm going to do the things in my life that make me feel good, it actually helps and fuel other things. The more pleasure we have, the more, pleasure, the more we prioritize our pleasure, the more pleasure we're actually going to have. And so when I say it, like, there's so much judgment, right, around pleasure. And so just saying, like, think about it, like, what actually makes you feel good? What do you do in your life that you didn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get? Because we're all deserving of it. And so, that was a big part of me, was like clearing out pleasure and prioritizing pleasure, and then realizing, like, we got to get rid of the shame. And here's the other thing. You don't actually get rid of these pleasure thieves. You just learn to manage them. And so they still come up for me in my relationships and with my partners and with my listeners. And so one of the big things is just realizing that we're always learning and like peeling back the layers. And so what I also realize is that once I can kind of take a look at it and realize that, like, and I encourage everyone to do this too, that we are deserving of pleasure, that pleasure is our birthright. It's going to help us in every area of our life. And then how do we get into, realizing that we are, that we want to understand our sex lives. Now, that the book is also about these 5 principles of sex IQ. And so I just want to run through quickly, is that once we realize that these are things blocking us, we can actually lean in and understand. When people wanted these quick tips too, I thought, what is a way that I can help people and help myself? This is something I was doing on my own. For example, anyone ever in a relationship, they're like, I'm not really in the mood for sex. I might just want connection. I might just want intimacy, but what is keeping me? So the 5 pillars that I think are really important that I was just doing when I would talk to a client or I talk to a listener. And the first one is really embodiment. How in our bodies are we? Am I allowing myself to receive sex right now? Am I allowing myself to, I'm sorry, guys, I didn't even look at what time I started. So maybe someone can tell me here. Embodiment is about, everyone had the experience here where they're having sex, but they're really thinking about their to-do list, or they're really thinking about, can the kids hear me? So it was like, am I in my body? Or am I staring at the ceiling and avoiding something? And the second one is our health, our overall health and wellness. Am I moving my body? Is there blood flow? Am I eating foods that make me feel good? And then there's the mental health. Have I worked through trauma and shame that might be keeping me from that? So these are all the things that I think we also, there's such a perfectionist tool, I think, around sex too, but realizing that it's not one thing. Sex is a skill set, and it's something that we build over time. So the second one is looking at our health. How am I doing in these areas? And the third one is collaboration. How am I communicating about sex? We talk about shame. If it is this heady stew for you and you think, I've never talked about sex before to anybody. And in fact, a lot of the messages I've received are kind of negative. And I never talked to my partner about sex. In fact, I'm going to tell you this, that 99% of the people I talk to have never had a healthy conversation around sex with a partner. And they assume that their partners are mind readers and they're going to figure it out. So really just getting more comfortable talking about sex. And believe me, I did not come out of the womb talking about sex. It was not always comfortable for me, but there's something about normalizing and talking about it and just saying to your partner, hey, I realize we've never talked about sex. Is it something that you would be into talking about? And it gets, promise you it gets easier from there. And the next one is our self-acceptance. This is like our confidence level. Do I accept my body where I'm at today? And here's another way where I feel like sometimes I'm not feeling so great in my body. People aren't. They're like, that is blocking us from our pleasure. So what are exercises that we can do to allow us to feel more confident and better in our bodies so we can show up? And then the last one is like self-knowledge. I have to tell you that we all have knowledge, about what feels good to us and our bodies, but yet we often go into the bedroom like we close our eyes and we hope for the best. I hope they figure it out. I hope my partner's a mind reader. And so we realize that we do have experience. We've all had, whether we've just had sex with ourselves or anyone else, we do have a knowledge and understanding. And so running through all of these pillars and thinking about like, what do I deserve? How do I get more pleasure in life? How do I connect with my partner more? These are all just such important tools to look at and realize at the end of the day, probably a lot of what we've been told about sex, and I know what I was told isn't really true. There's a lot of misinformation about there, and there's a lot of shame and worry that we're not keeping up with the Joneses and everyone's having better sex than we are. But what I just want to say is that what I've learned in all these years is that we're all responsible for our own pleasure, our own sex lives, our own orgasms. No one else is supposed to give it to us. They're not going to give us our pleasure or our great sex. It's something that we really, if we are prioritizing it, it's important to us. We have to figure out what makes us feel good. And the first steps is looking at our authentic self and think about like, what is holding me back? And you can do this in conjunction with a partner or with yourself. But it's so freeing to realize that there's really just, it's up to us and we get to, be on a journey of exploration. It is a skill set, learning to talk about these things, learning to feel safe in our bodies, learning to communicate about sex, that it's not as tricky as we think. It's not some magic formula. It's just like our overall health and wellness. And for so long, sex was sort of the stepchild of the wellness industry. And what I love right now is that people are really realizing that if we are not sexually well and sexually healthy, it's going to impact every area of our life. And so I think for me, stepping into this journey that I'm always still on and realizing that and I can help others realize that we are, we're in charge of it and we get to decide what makes us feel good. And so the next time maybe that you're not in the mood for connection, you're not in the mood for sex or pleasure, you can run through these pillars. You can check out my book, you can look at my podcast and think like, come up with your own answers. Like what might be keeping me from having more pleasure in my life? That's sexual liberation. And then we'll really be able to evolve the conversation around sex, evolve our own relationships to our bodies and pleasure, and have the sex lives and really the life that we deserve. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Emily. I can say it is a true pleasure to know you and to hear you speak and share everything that you've learned. There's so much wisdom there for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.